Hey Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. Today's topic comes to us from commenter C. Guston. C. Guston wants to know about the technology of Numenor, specifically how it relates to Middle-earth, how it relates to Middle-earth of the Third Age, and what kind of tech we might expect to see from Numenor in the Amazon series. Okay, so that's a few different layers of questions. So let's start with the basics. Okay, let's start with what we know about Numenorean tech. All right, obviously Numenor, that's the Second Age, which is the age that the Amazon series is taking place. Before the end of the Second Age, Numenor, the island, sinks into the sea along with a whole bunch of its tech. But let's start with, this is a letter from Tolkien in which he describes generally his thoughts on how one should visualize Numenorians. The Numenorians of Gondor were proud, peculiar, and archaic, and I think are best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways, they resembled Egyptians, the love of and power to construct, the gigantic and massive, and in their great interest in ancestry and in tombs. So, there we have a starting place for what we can imagine Numenorean tech might be like, and how it relates to Middle-earth. You think of Middle-earth as Western Europe in a lot of ways, so think of the difference between Egypt and Western Europe 5,000 years ago. And that's probably a good indication of the different levels of tech and culture that we're seeing between Numenor and Middle-earth at that time, Second Age. We get a few passages in the Unfinished Tales that describe life in Numenor and kind of the cultural and technological facets that we see in everyday Numenorian life. In Numenor, all journeyed from place to place on horseback. For in riding, the Numenorians, both men and women, took delight, and all the people of the land loved horses. It is said in old tales that where there was great love between men and women and their favorite steeds, they could be summoned at need by thought alone. Therefore, the roads of Numenor were for the most part unpaved, made intended for riding, since coaches and carriages were little used in the earlier centuries, and heavy cargoes were borne by sea. The chief and most ancient road, suitable for wheels, ran from the greatest port, Romena, in the east, to Anduniae in the west. Along it passed wains, bearing stone from the northlands that was most esteemed for building, and timber, in which the westlands were rich. So we see that the roads, for the most part, are unpaved, except for this one central artery that runs across the island. Horseback riding is in vogue, which means there's got to be herds of horses on this island. And because it is an island, they use ships to transport large, heavy loads of equipment. One of the things to keep in mind here, and I'll kind of come back to this as I talk about the decline of technology in the Third Age, is the support that our Numenorians got from elves, the Eldar. And here's a passage from Unfinished Tales that points that out. The Edain brought with them to Numenor the knowledge of many crafts, and many craftsmen who had learned from the Eldar, besides preserving lore and traditions of their own. But they could bring with them few materials, save for the tools of their crafts. And for long, all metals in Numenor were precious metals. They brought with them many treasures of gold and silver, and gems also. But they did not find these things in Numenor. They loved them for their beauty, and it was this love that first aroused in them cupidity, greed, in later days when they fell under the shadow and became proud and unjust in their dealings with the lesser folk of Middle-earth. So you see here how the elves imparted lots of useful lore and craftsmanship to the Numenorians. But when the Numenorians came to the island, they couldn't bring everything with them. So they brought kind of the things that were precious to them, and then had to kind of start from scratch in a way on Numenor. And there's a mention there that it was those love of possessions and things that eventually got corrupted and twisted toward the end, leading up to the downfall of Numenor. So here's a passage about the weapon crafting in Numenor. It's really fascinating, actually. Here we go. Some metals they found in Numenor, and as their cunning in mining and in smelting and smithying swiftly grew, things of iron and copper became common. Among the rights of the Edain were weaponsmiths, and they had, with the teaching of the Noldor, acquired great skill in the forging of swords, of axe blades, and of spearheads and knives. Swords the Guild of Weaponsmiths still made, for the preservation of the craft, though most of their labor was spent on the fashioning of tools for the uses of peace. The king and most of the great chieftains possessed swords as heirlooms of their fathers. But no man wore a sword in Numenor, and for long years few indeed were the weapons of warlike intent that were made in the land. Axes and spears and bows they had, and shooting with bows on foot and on horseback was the chief sport and pastime of the Numenorians. In later days, in the wars upon Middle-earth, it was the bows of the Numenorians that were most greatly feared. The men of the sea, it was said, send before them a great cloud, as a rain turned to serpents, or a black hail tipped with steel. And in those days, the great cohorts of the king's archers used bows made of hollow steel, with black-feathered arrows, a full ell long from point to notch. I had to look this up, but an ell is a unit of measurement. Originally, it was supposed to be elbow to tip of the finger. So, I don't know, roughly 20 inches or so. However, that unit measurement got codified in England, and eventually it was 45 inches. So you imagine a 45-inch arrow. A modern arrow is, say, 30, 35 inches. So it's bigger than your typical arrow. And it's shot from a bow made of hollow steel. That's the part that really got me. Like, whoa, okay. These guys were wielding some kind of like steel composite bows. So obviously the tech there quite high. I also found it interesting that the citizenry of Numenor didn't tend to wear swords, weapons of war. That a sword was seen as, say, an heirloom to pass down for the great chieftains. But, bows and such for hunting, that kind of thing was acceptable, but they were more about peace and plowshares than they were about war. And here's a passage about what became the defining characteristic in some ways of the Numenorians, the navy. And after the elvish steersmen departed and took with them the most part of their ships, it was long before the Numenorians themselves ventured far to sea. But there were shipwrights among them who had been instructed by the Eldar, and by their own study and devices they improved their art until they dared to sail ever further into the deep waters. When 600 years had passed from the beginning of the Second Age, Veantur, captain of the king's ships under Tar Elendil, first achieved the voyage to Middle-earth. He brought his ship into Mithlond, the Grey Havens, on the spring winds blowing from the west, and he returned in the autumn of the following year. Thereafter, seafaring became the chief enterprise for daring and hardihood among the men of Numenor. So for 600 years or so, they stayed fairly close to shore. They didn't have the wherewithal to make that journey, say, to Middle-earth. And here it is, this Veantur, captain of the king's ships, makes that journey. That actually ties into last week's video about Aldarion. Veantur takes Aldarion under his wing, and that leads to Aldarion really becoming fascinated with ships, and the rest is history there. So we've got a little bit of a view here of what life is like on Numenor. Lots of horseback riding, unpaved roads. You've got people aren't necessarily walking around clad in armor and ready to fight. However, their technology with bows is apparently very impressive. Their shipbuilding and sailing prowess is slow to take off, but once it does, it really takes off. And that brings us to their architecture. As you saw in that letter that Tolkien wrote comparing them to the Egyptians, he mentions that they specialized in building things of massive scale. And so we see that. I think the best version of that is actually the Tower of Orthanc. Orthanc was not built by Saruman, wasn't built by the Rohirrim or anything like that. It's built by Numenoreans. And I'm going to read you the description of Orthanc and just how awe-inspiringly awesome it is. There stood a tower of marvelous shape. It was fashioned by the builders of old, who smoothed the ring of Isengard, and yet it seemed a thing not made by the craft of men, but riven from the bones of the earth in the ancient torment of the hills. A peak and isle of rock it was, black and gleaming hard. 4 mighty piers of many-sided stone were welded into one, but near the summit they opened into gaping horns, their pinnacles sharp as the points of spears, keen-edged as knives. Between them was a narrow space, and there upon a floor of polished stone, written with strange signs, a man might stand 500 feet above the plain. This was Orthanc, the citadel of Saruman, the name of which had, by design or chance, a twofold meaning. For in the Elvish speech, Orthanc signifies Mount Fang, but in the language of the Mark of old, the cunning mind. So there, that last bit, Mount Fang and cunning mind. The cunning mind would be Saruman. Mount Fang is a good description of what Orthanc might look like out on the plains. So you combine the two. Saruman dwelling in Mount Fang. The fact that it's 4 mighty piers of stone. So they took 4 basically giant rocks and welded them together and made this amazing architectural wonder. Think about it, even the Ents, when they destroy Isengard, and they do a really good job of that, they attempt to damage Orthanc, and they can't. These incredibly powerfully strong creatures can't even put a dent in the sides of the walls of Orthanc. It is a marvel of construction. Another impressive architectural feat was Minas Morgul, which obviously when the Numenoreans built it was called Minas Ithil. And as I read you this passage, there's a really interesting little technological extra that they added to this tower. High on a rocky seat upon the black knees of the Ephel Duoth stood the walls and tower of Minas Morgul. All was dark about it, earth and sky, but it was lit with light, not the imprisoned moonlight welling through the marble walls of Minas Ithil long ago, tower of the moon, fair and radiant in the hollow of the hills. A corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing. In the walls and tower windows showed, like countless black holes looking inward into emptiness. But the topmost course of the tower revolved slowly, first one way and then another, a huge ghostly head leering into the night. So it has a revolving tower head at the top of Minas Morgul, and I'm assuming that is Numenorean make. Hence, it's been doing that for thousands of years. Orthanc and Minas Morgul are incredible architectural feats. So I found another passage that highlights a different aspect of Numenorean technology and learning. This one, it centers around Meneldur, who, again, this is from last week's video, but he is Tar Aldarian's father. He was king of Numenor once upon a time. Meneldur was a man of gentle mood, without pride, whose exercise was rather in thought than in deeds of the body. He loved dearly the land of Numenor and all things in it, but he gave no heed to the sea that lay all about it. For his mind looked further than Middle-earth. He was enamored of the stars and the heavens. He built a tower in the Forest Star, the northernmost region of the island, where the airs were clearest, from which by night he would survey the heavens and observe all the movements of the lights of the firmament. So it sounds like he built an observatory. It was tracking the movement of the stars. Of course, later, much later, when the Numenoreans end up in Middle-earth, and you've got Osgiliath and the Dome of Stars, I think this is all, showing again that they actually had a pretty good grasp of astronomy. They had to follow a star to Numenor in the first place. So their astronomical knowledge was, I would say, at a high level. And just for fun, I'm going to read you some kind of pie-in-the-sky stuff that Tolkien wrote. It's not canon, but it is published in the History of Middle-earth. Christopher Tolkien took a bunch of various writings of his dad and put them into this 12-volume compendium. Well, one of those volumes contains The Lost Road. The Lost Road describes a very different Numenor, let's put it that way. So this is an early concept of Numenor, but there were a lot of similarities to the Numenor that we have come to understand. So I'm going to read you this passage, and you'll see right away how their technology seems a bit higher at this stage of his conception of Numenor than what it ended up being. Our ships go now without the wind, and many are made of metal that sheareth hidden rocks, and they sink not in calm or storm, but they are no longer fair to look upon. Our towers grow ever stronger and climb ever higher, but beauty they leave behind upon earth. We who have no foes are embattled with impregnable fortresses, and mostly on the west. Our arms are multiplied as if for an age-long war, and men are ceasing to give love or care to the making of other things for use or delight. But our shields are impenetrable. Our swords cannot be withstood. Our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. Stop there for a second. Our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. A league is 3 miles. So leagues is at least 6 miles. Darts are like thunder makes it sound like gunpowder. And they're shooting these things 6 miles unerringly. Seems like cannons, perhaps, to me, with like some kind of a, targeting system. Anyway, it's that's. Plus, he's talking about ships that are made of metal that don't need the wind, so they don't need sails. These are steam-powered ships, probably something like that, made of metal. So it's a steampunk look, basically steampunk Numenor. But just to add on to that, just when you thought like, whoa, that's different, he threw in this little extra paragraph. Therefore, many abandon the gods and put them out of their legends. But men of Middle-earth looked up with wonder upon them, and with great fear, for they descended out of the air, and they took the Numenorians to be gods, and some were content that this should be so. So you've got Numenorians flying down to Middle-earth and then being perceived as gods because they came out of the sky. And they were content that this should be so. That's fine, you think of me as a god. Why don't you go make me a nice sandwich? So you've got this situation where they have the power of flight. Probably like flying ships, perhaps? Something akin to gliders or airplanes, something like that. Obviously, this rendition of Numenorians is not canon. It directly contradicts what we know about from the Silmarillion. For instance, when the Armada gets built, and Ar-Pharazôn goes to attack the Valar, that's sails. They're sailing on the wind. They are not steam shipping along in big metal ships. So this is not canon by any means. However, it is published. It was some thought at one time of Tolkien's. I suppose there is a minuscule chance that the Amazon series might go, steampunk Numenor sounds cool, and decide to go that route. I doubt it. But will they show a stark difference in the tech between Numenor and Middle-earth? Yeah. I do feel like Numenor is going to be more industrialized. And think about the fact that they came over and defeated Sauron twice very definitively, whereas the rest of Middle-earth was getting whooped, essentially, by Sauron, and it was the Numenorians who were like, all right, fine, we'll send over a navy and we'll take him out. And so they had to be, militarily at least, far superior to what we were seeing in Middle-earth at that time. So, a question that comes up a lot in a lot of medieval tales, of which Lord of the Rings would be one, is why doesn't the tech seem to accelerate, similarly to what we see in the real world? And that is a legit gripe for much of fantasy literature. I think it's something that a lot of authors maybe don't take into account. However, I think there's actually some legit in-universe reasons why the tech doesn't go up at any kind of a straight line in Middle-earth. And I should note that it would also be very unfair to compare the tech advancement level of, say, of Middle-earth to our modern times. I mean, our tech currently advances practically daily, I don't want to get like old man back in my day, but back in my day, I'm filming this right now on my cell phone. When I originally started doing filming projects back in high school, I was so excited, spent all my money on this giant camcorder, portable camcorder that was basically the size of an anvil. And I would just heft it around and record with it. It's not that long. I'm not that old, damn it, that we are now in this different technological age where that's not even considered anymore. That's just one thing. Anyway, point being, we're kind of in an exception to the rule of technological advancement. We're like, whoop! Whereas if you think back, I think a good real world analog to our Numenor in the Second Age versus tech in the Third Age in Middle-earth would be the Roman occupation of Britain. So the Romans actually didn't rule Britain for all that long. I think it was 300 years or so. They left in 410 AD. But what they brought to Britain were some startling technological advancements. Paved roads, coins, written language, city planning, sewage disposal, heated bathhouses, a 75-mile heavily fortified wall, amazing state-of-the-art weapons and siege weapons. And when they left, it ushered in the Dark Ages in Britain. For several hundred years after the Romans left, technology took a bit of a nosedive. They still had the remnants of Roman culture because a lot of the stuff was built out of stone, and so they used it or used parts of it. But the culture took a bit of a step back. And so even as we see in England, it's not like a straight line of technological advancement up to modern day. It took a few bumps and valleys. So what are some reasons why the Third Age of Middle-earth was perhaps technologically less than the Second Age of Numenor? Well, for one thing, when Numenor was destroyed, a huge percentage of its population died, and obviously a lot of its tech sank. And so those who escaped Elendil and such, and the 7 ships, they had to start over. And there were already Numenorians who were living on Middle-earth at the time, but they lost a whole bunch of the lore and culture that they had once had. Also, downfall of Numenor affected the western shores of Middle-earth. That wasn't all of Middle-earth, but if you lived on that coastline, there were some major upheavals happening, earthquakes and such. So it was kind of a natural catastrophe that happened in that moment. Shortly thereafter, like 100 years later, you had the War of the Last Alliance. And while the good guys won, the good guys also took a bunch of casualties. It was a world war. And so that was kind of devastating to the people. And there are a series of crises that happen in Middle-earth that I think would stunt the growth technologically and culturally. One of those would be Arnor splitting up into 3 parts. You've got a civil war in Gondor, the Witch King attacking Arnor. There's all kinds of outside forces attacking kind of throughout time. But you've got something huge was the Great Plague. The Great Plague comes in right around the middle of the Third Age, and it's just devastating. It wipes out a sizable percentage of the population of Middle-earth. And that's obviously going to set society back quite a bit. You're just struggling to survive on a daily basis. So this series of crises, I think, definitely contributed to the decline of technology in the Third Age. Also, as I mentioned before, Numenor really relied heavily on the input of elves. I was reading those passages where they were talking about, crafting of items, sailing and shipbuilding. All these things were things that they got from the elves. What we see in the Third Age is that the elves and the dwarves, who are also, obviously dwarves are great at metal smithing and mining and such. They have lore that they could impart. They withdraw. And so we don't have the interaction between humans and, say, elves and dwarves. And so I think without that input from these other races, humans suffer technologically. I'm going to read you another passage from Unfinished Tales in which Tolkien describes how the Seeing Stones, the Palantiri, kind of faded away into lore instead of actually being items that people might use. One reason was the decay of Gondor and the waning of interest in or knowledge of ancient history among all but a few even of the high men of the realm. Gondor, after the kings, declined into a middle age of fading knowledge and simpler skills. Communications depended on messengers and errand riders, or in times of urgency, upon beacons. The beacons are lit! And if the stones of Anor and Orthanc were still guarded as treasures out of the past, known to exist only by a few, the 7 stones of old were by the people generally forgotten, and the rhymes of lore that spoke of them were, if remembered, no longer understood. Their operations were transformed in legend into the elvish powers of the ancient kings with their piercing eyes. Here's something that, in its heyday, the Numenoreans used to communicate very effectively, or their version of cell phones, essentially. By the time we get to the end of the Third Age, people don't even understand what they were for. They just see them as relics of some time gone by. Just to show that idea of the Third Age in decline. So there you go. A little overview of Numenorean tech. This little pie-in-the-sky look at this steampunk Numenor that I don't think will ever go anywhere, but is fun to think about. And some reasons why the Third Age lagged technologically behind Numenor when it comes to things like all of these crises that occurred, and the fact that these other races that had a lot of lore to impart had withdrawn and were no longer free with their lore giving. Thanks so much for the topic, C. Gustin. I hope that answered your question. If you out there have a question you'd like me to cover, please put it in the comments below. I'd be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks, everybody.